Shalom Aleichem Mishpachim. All right, we are going to continue in the book of Vayikra, Torah portion of Tzav. We are in the third Aliyah. All right, let us begin. All right, let me just make sure where we are at. Oops. Vayikra, second. All right, chapter 7, verse 11 through 38. All right, verse 11, chapter 7, Parshas Tzav, book of Vayikra, Leviticus. Onkelos and Torah on top, and other commentary on the bottom. Verse 11. This is the law of the holy sacrifice that one will offer before the Lord. Verse 11. Law of, see commentary, holy sacrifice. The biblical Hebrew shalamim in this context. The Todah, Thanksgiving offering discussed in this section, differed from other shalamim in two ways. More loaves were offered, and they may be consumed only during a single day and night, in contrast to the other shalamim, which might be eaten over 2 days. According to the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot 54b, a Todah was offered as thanks to God after a person crossed a desert or sea, was released from prison, or recovered from a serious illness. Today, many Jews who have experienced these possibly dangerous situations attend the synagogue service, are called to the reading of the Torah and recite a special Thanksgiving prayer. Verse 12, Torah and Onkelos. If he will offer it for a Thanksgiving sacrifice, he will offer with Thanksgiving sacrifice unleavened cakes that are mixed with oil, unleavened wafers that are saturated with oil, and cakes of choice flour that are mixed with oil. Verse 12, will offer thanksgiving, as with the chatat and the asham. The Aramaic retains the Hebrew root and does not explain the name of the Torah sacrifice. With the thanksgiving sacrifice, the biblical Hebrew al zevach ha-todah, he offered 3 kinds of unleavened bread as well as one offering of leavened bread for the Todah. Didn't chapter 2 verse 11 forbid the placement of unleavened bread on the altar? Yes, but this leavened bread was not placed on the altar. Onkelos retains the biblical al, which literally means on, both in this passage and in verse 13. Chazkuni in the Sadi Agon and even Ezra on verse 13, among other commentators, argue that al in this verse should be understood as with, but Nachmanides insists that it should be translated literally because the unleavened cakes, wafers, and bread were stacked on the surface. Verse 13, Torah and Onkelos. With loaves of leavened bread, he will offer his sacrifice. It should be presented with the thanksgiving holy sacrifice. Verse 14, he will offer one of each offering as a separation before the Lord. It belongs to the priest who will sprinkle the blood of the holy sacrifice. Verse 13, with. Bible and Onkelos has al. See commentary on verse 12. His sacrifice. Rashi, based on Sifra, notes that unlike other sacrifices, the Todah does not possess an intrinsic sanctity, and it may be redeemed for money under certain conditions, such as if it were carried out of the courtyard and thereby lost its sanctity. Holy sacrifice. In this context, it is shalamim. Verse 14, he will offer. The Aramaic uses the future rather than Scripture's past tense, as in verses 8 and 9, and will sprinkle each one. One of the 4 loaves, as well as the breast and shoulder of the sacrifices, are given to the officiating priest. The rest is eaten by the person making the offering. Separation. In this context, the biblical is teruma. Before, will sprinkle, as with, he will offer, earlier in the verse. The Aramaic changes the biblical present to the future, since the verse concerns a future event. Holy sacrifice. In this context, it is Shalamim. Verse 15, Torah and Onkelos. The flesh of his thanksgiving holy sacrifice must be eaten on the same day it is offered. None of it may remain until morning. Verse 16. However, if the sacrifice that he offers is a vow or a free will offering, it must be eaten on the same day that he will offer his sacrifice. But what remains may be eaten on the next day. Verse 15. The flesh of his thanksgiving sacrifice. The Todah was treated differently than other sacrifices because it expressed a more elevated feeling of gratitude to God and was not prompted by the concern of guilt or a reaction to fear. Must be eaten. Maimonides, in his book Guide of the Perplexed, states that the Torah wanted the Israelites to show proper respect to the sacrifices, so that they should not, after frequent usage, begin to appear despicable. Therefore, the Torah mandated certain restrictions to diminish over familiarity. The sacrifices should only be eaten in a state of ritual purity. One who was uncircumcised could not eat it. It could not be consumed if it were left after a certain time period or an improper intention had been conceived, and it had to be eaten in a particular place. Similarly, the sacrifices had to be devoted to God, and whoever took parts of a sacrifice for common use had committed a significant trespass. Verse 16, vow, free will. Biblical Hebrew, nedar, nedava. Again, as with the chetat, asham, and todah, thanksgiving, sacrifice, Onkelos does not define or explain these two offerings, and only incorporates the Hebrew root into the translation. Ibn Ezra and Chazkuni clarify that a vow is generally prompted by worry in a time of stress, while the free will offering emanates from a spirit of giving. The free will offering is different than the Torah, for the latter is connected with a dangerous event, from which the person is thankful to have been saved. Maimonides, in his Guide of the Perplexed, explains that while a non-priest eats the thanksgiving offering, the priest is forbidden to do so. Will offer. Scripture's past tense is again changed and rendered as the future, as in verses 8, 9, and 14. What remains? Rashi contends that the introductory vav of vehanotar here is superfluous. He explains that there are many examples of superfluous vavs in Scripture, such as Genesis chapter 36, verse 24, and Daniel chapter 8, verse 13. The Saadia Gaon translates the word as if it lacked the vav. However, Ibn Ezra argues that the vav is necessary here, and this is how Onkelos renders the word. Verse 18. Verse 17. Torah and Onkelos. What remains of the sacrifice's flesh must be burned in the fire on the third day. Verse 18. If any of the flesh of his holy sacrifices is eaten on the third day, it will not be accepted. It will not be counted to the credit of him who offered it. It is a rejected thing. The person who eats of it will receive his transgression. Verse 18. His holy sacrifice, biblical Hebrew shalamav. See commentary. It will not be accepted. These words mean that the sacrifices is not efficacious. B. Our Targumist inserts the word Yehei, to be, to enhance the clarity of the passage, as in chapter 5, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, chapter 6, verse 2, chapter 7, verse 18, and many other verses. He also appends a lamed, which is to le'ava, literally to be accepted. The word to is syntactically appropriate in Aramaic, but not in English, and was therefore left out of our translation. A rejected thing. The meaning of Scripture's pigul here is obscure. Various definitions have been suggested. Neophiti, Pseudo-Jonathan, and the fragmented Targum have pesul, defective. Ibn Janach, the Saadia Gaon, and the Samaritan Targums chose putrid, disgusting, or revoked, respectively. Sifra offers no definition. Our Targumist is evasive, even as he is with most of Leviticus's technical terms. He paraphrases with merachak, which literally means distant, because the sacrifice is rejected. However, he also uses this evasive term in place of Scripture's orla, nida, and to'eva, without defining these matters. The Babylonian Talmud in Zevachim 28-29, Sifra, Rashi, Bechar Skor, and Rashbam cite a Shemua. Tradition, that despite the plain reading of verse 18, which seems to state that the sacrifice becomes pigul if eaten on the third day, the offering actually becomes pigul immediately, repulsive, if while sacrificing it he thought he would eat it on the third day. The tradition proves its point by focusing on the literal meaning of lo yechashev, not thought, even though this is not its plain meaning, for the words refer to the sacrifice. It is not considered and not the sacrifice. Logic supports the traditional explanation if it only becomes pigul, repulsive, by being eaten on the third day. How is it possible that the sacrifice, which was offered 3 days earlier, be presumably accepted by God at that time, could become unacceptable 3 days later? Person, biblical Hebrew nefesh in this context. Receive. The Targums characteristically substitute the more precise receive for Scripture's carry, when the latter is a metaphor. Transgression. Onkelos renders chatat, asham, and avon, the latter word used here as chov, without distinguishing them. See commentary verse. Even if the donor changes his mind and decides to eat the sacrifice within the prescribed time, it is still pigul, rejected. All right, verse 19. Torah and Onkelos. Holy flesh that touches anything unclean may not be eaten. It must be burned in fire. But other holy flesh, anyone who is clean for holy matters may eat holy flesh. Verse 20. But a person who eats flesh from the holy sacrifice before the Lord, while he is unclean, the person shall be cut off from his people. Verse 19. Holy, 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 holy. Our Targumist adds holy 4 times in this passage to identify, as does Sifra, that we are speaking of sacrificial flesh, to incorporate the unambiguous language from verse 20, and to explain why Scripture uses the definite article, the flesh. Verse 20, a person, and in this context, the Hebrew is ve hanefesh. See commentary. Onkelos deletes the definite article he, which is the, which is grammatically superfluous here, and uses the spelling in Scripture that is in the following verse. Holy sacrifice. Biblical Hebrew in this context is shalamim. The person. This time, the hay of hanefesh is appropriate and is retained in the Targum. Cut off from his people. Rashi, on chapter 17, verse 9, defines karet, excision, as a punishment in which one's own life and the life of one's children is cut short. Nachmanides disagrees. In chapter 18, verse 29, he points out that we can see many people who should be punished with karet, who live long lives. He therefore states that karet is a punishment that is administered in the world to come, and that the belief in life after death is therefore rooted in this punishment. All right, verse 21, Torah and Onkelos. When a person touches anything unclean, human uncleanness, animal uncleanness, or any detestable uncleanness, and then eats flesh from a holy sacrifice, the person shall be cut off. The sacrifice before the Lord, the person shall be cut off from his people. The Lord spoke with Moses, saying, Speak with the Israelites, saying, You shall not eat fat of an ox, sheep, or goat. All right, verse 21. A person. Again, the biblical Hebrew in this context has ve nefesh. Detestable uncleanness. The unclean things are mentioned in chapter 11. Holy sacrifice before. The Bible has this as shalamim. The person. Hanefesh. Verse 22, the Targum replaces 2 here and in verse 23 as in chapter 1, verse 1. Verse 23, Torah and Onkelos. Speak with the Israelites, saying, You shall not eat fat of an ox, sheep, or goat. Verse 24, fat from animals that died or that were fatally torn may be put to any other use, as long as you do not eat it. Verse 23, you shall not eat fat. Even Ezra describes an encounter with the Sadducee. He meant a Karaite, since the Sadducees disappeared soon after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, while the Karaite sect began in the 8th or 9th century and still exists today. Both rejected the rabbinic interpretations of the biblical text. The Karaites insisted that the plain meaning of chapter 3, verse 17, and chapter 7, verse 22 through verse 27 prohibits eating any animal fat. Yet the rabbis misconstrued the text and stated that Jews are allowed to eat certain fats. Ibn Ezra explained how he believed that the text could be read to support the rabbinical view. Whether one agrees with Ibn Ezra that the text could be read as the rabbis interpreted it or not, it is a fact that the rabbinical understanding of the text does not always conform to its plain meaning. This can also be seen in the biblical rule prohibiting the eating of blood. Yet the rabbis taught that Jews may eat the blood of fish. See commentary. See also verse 18 for another example where the rabbinical interpretation is contrary to the plain meaning of the text and the highlight to this chapter. Verse 24, fatally torn. Biblical Hebrew in this context is terefa. Any other use. Although the fats may not be eaten, it may be used for other purposes. Do not eat it. One who eats this fat violates two laws, the prohibition of eating fat and the prohibition of eating dead or fatally torn animals. Verse 25, Torah, if anyone will eat animal fat from which a sacrifice may be offered before the Lord, the person who will eat it will be cut off from his people. Verse 26, you must not eat any blood in any of your settlements, of bird and of animal. Verse 25, will eat. The Targums turn Scripture's present tense, eats, into the future because that form is in verses 24, 26, and 27. Sacrifice, before. Biblical Hebrew for sacrifice in the fire offering too. The person. Biblical Hebrew has it as hanefesh. Verse 26, in any of your settlements, one might have thought that since the prohibition against eating blood is stated within the laws dealing with sacrifices, it applies only to Canaan/Israel when the temple is standing. The Torah therefore stresses that it applies everywhere and at all times. The Bible uses the same language for other laws such as matzah and the Sabbath. Onkelos and the Sadiagon substitute the more familiar and idiomatic of for the Bible somewhat unusual too, twice. Verse 27, Torah and Onkelos. Any person who will eat blood, the person shall be cut off from his people. The Lord spoke with Moses, saying, speak with the Israelites and tell them, when anyone offers his holy sacrifice before the Lord, he must bring his offering before the Lord from his holy sacrifice. Verse 28. All right, verse 29. With, commentary, holy sacrifice before holy sacrifice. Scripture has zevach shalamav, and twice. See commentary verses, chapter 3, verse 1, and chapter 3, verse 3. The second kadam, which is before, is introduced by a lamed, le kadam, instead of the usual kadam, probably only to vary the usage. Verses 29 and 30 concern the duties of the lay Israelite in the presentation of the shalamim. Unlike the holier sacrifices discussed in chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 10, where ordinary Israelites were not allowed to participate with the priests in the offering, they joined as partners of sorts with the priests in the offering of shalamim, the peace offerings. Although they were unable to place a sacrifice on the altar, they performed the tenufa, the waving of the offering, as discussed in verse 30. They also placed their hands on the sacrifice, as they did for even the holier sacrifices. Verse 30, Torah and Onkelos, in his own hands he shall bring the sacrifice of the Lord. He presents the fat with the breast to be presented as a presentation before the Lord. The priest burns the fat on the altar, but the breast belongs to Aaron and his sons. Verse 30, in his own hands. Verse 30 in Onkelos does not state whose hands are meant. Sifra and Rashi clarify that a priest brings the fat and breast and places them in the hands of the owner, with the hands of a second priest beneath his, and the two raise it together. Sacrifice. The Targum explains Scripture's metaphor, fire, again, as in verse 5, chapter 1, verse 9, and many other passages. Presentation. As usual, a Targumist renders henif and tenufa, literally, raised, as present. Verse 31, belongs to Aaron. The breast may not be eaten until all the parts are burned on the altar. The sons of Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 15 through 17, gluttonously seized the breasts from the cooking pots and ate them before the other parts were placed on the altar, and were punished for their behavior by God with death. Verse 32, Torah. The leg of the right side you shall give to the priest as a gift from your holy sacrifices. He, from Aaron's sons, who offers the blood of the holy sacrifice and the fat, shall have the leg of the right side as a portion. Verse 32. Gift. Scripture has teruma, a raising, and the Targum uses afrashuta, literally separation. Holy sacrifices, shalamim. Who offers the blood. The priest who offers the blood receives the leg as his part of the offering, while the breast is shared by all of the priests. However, only priests who are in the state of ritual purity and capable of officiating at the sacrificial service were entitled to eat of these portions. Verse 34, Torah and Onkelos. For I have taken the breast of the presentation and the leg of the gift offering from the Israelites and their holy sacrifices. I gave them to Aaron, the priest, and to his sons for all time from the Israelites. Verse 35, these are Aaron's anointment, entitlement, and his son's anointment, entitlement, from the sacrifices of the Lord, from the day that they brought them forth to serve before the Lord. Verse 36, which the Lord commanded to be given from them, the day that they are anointed from the Israelites. It is an eternal law for all generations. Verse 34, breast of the presentation, the leg of the gift offering. See commentary. Verse 35, sacrifices, fire. All right, from the day, see commentary on chapter 6, verse 13, they brought. Onkelos pluralizes brought in accordance with the verse's context. Serve. Our Aramaic translation generally renders the Hebrew kohen as shamasha, serves, when it is used as a verb describing the activity, but retains the Hebrew noun when it serves as the title of an Israelite priest. Verse 36, which some commentators contend that Scripture's asher could read ka asher, just as. Here and in verse 38. Onkelos renders it as if it read asher, the wording in our text. From the day, see commentary. They are anointed. Onkelos again pluralizes the biblical singular. Verse 37, Torah and Onkelos. This is the law of the burnt meal, guilt, and penalty offerings, other offerings and holy sacrifices. Verse 38, which the Lord commanded Moses on the mountain of Sinai, on the day that he commanded the Israelites to offer their sacrifices before the Lord in the desert of Sinai. Verse 37, this is the law, see commentary. Offerings. Rashi and Ibn Ezra explain the biblical ve lami luim as a derivative from the root maleh, meaning the priestly initiation day, as described in Exodus chapter 29, verse 22. The Aramaic substitution describes what occurred on this day. Offerings were brought, holy sacrifices, shalamim. Verse 38, the mountain of Sinai, the desert of Sinai. Even Ezra explains that the Israelite nation offered no sacrifices until they arrived at Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. Also, they did not offer burnt offerings or paschal sacrifices during the desert wanderings, except for the one time at Mount Sinai, as indicated in Numbers chapter 9, 1 through 5. Because the Israelites, in his opinion, had no flocks in the desert, and because the Israelites did not circumcise themselves in the desert after they left Mount Sinai. It was only some 40 years later that Joshua ordered the circumcision of the people and required them to observe the Passover, as indicated in Joshua chapter 5, verse 2 through 10. Before. Again, the Targum inserts before to soften the possible implication that the sacrifices is directly given to an anthropomorphic deity. Onkelos highlights. Our commentaries on verses 18 and 23 present examples where the rabbinical interpretations of the text found in the Talmuds and Midrashim differ from the plain meaning of the Bible's words. A classic example of this phenomenon is where the rabbis interpret an eye for an eye as the payment of money. Onkelos retains the literal wording. However, today's Judaism is practiced according to the teachings of the Torah as they are interpreted by the rabbis in what is called the oral law. And that is the reading of Onkelos on the Torah, Leviticus, Parshas Tzav.